Dear friends of Books and Voices of Revelation, welcome to the narration of the following audio book, The Silence of Adam, by Larry Crabb. Second part. Something vital is missing. The problems of the male community. If a man is honest with himself, at the very moment he feels most threatened, he will admit that he feels terror and doubt. At this point, instead of surrendering to Christ with humility and faith, leaving behind explanations and guarantees, you are more likely to ask yourself a convenient question to which there is only one discouraging answer, so you live in fear, desperately determined to avoid its insufficiency is exposed. He gives little consideration to what it would mean to give himself as a man. Men in general live without a clear vision of what the masculine movement would be like when entering life, especially in relationships. They have lost the joy of dreaming. When you lose contact with Christ, you can no longer dream noble dreams. Chapter 8. Men who fight against darkness. Nice, that's how he was. Kind, attentive, respectful, interested in honoring God in every way, especially in the treatment of women. He would be 40 in 2 months. Still he was released. There is nothing wrong with that. The Apostle Paul seemed to think this was a higher calling. It wasn't that I didn't want to get married or that I had a problem with the opposite sex. And he certainly had no homosexual inclinations. The right girl just hadn't come along. I knew he had high standards. Was it that bad? If some of your friends had higher standards today, they wouldn't be in the middle of so many marital problems. Perhaps this group of singles was God's provision. He had to admit that there were a lot of good women in the other 3, but maybe they were all involved in the wrong churches. Doctrine was important to him. Now that he was older, he could see more clearly. Of the 3 churches I had attended since college, that included the last 15 years, each had been off in some basic and important way. Now he saw it. The first church was very charismatic, although he had been attracted to it when he was younger. The second, very legalistic. The third, well, a little too traditional, with too much liturgy. Now that he was in the right church, perhaps God would provide him with the right partner. I would wait and see. And I would pray, naturally. The last woman, a great person, attractive, pious, and very available, but for the wrong reason. She had already been married. He wasn't sure if it was a sin to marry a divorced woman, but he really wanted to keep his standards high. He broke up with her just before he became weak enough to propose. It was close. He thanked God for the strength to walk away. And the 2 women before that? He only dated 3 seriously. Some quotes scattered throughout those years, but no concrete possibility. One liked it. They really seemed to get along well. Then suddenly he felt cold. She said something about feeling like he missed her. They just stopped connecting. She said he was nice, like a casual friend. She wanted more. Probably immature. A girl looking for fun and excitement. She wanted a Prince Charming to arrive on a white horse and take her away. Well, he wanted his wife to be down to earth, someone who lived to serve Christ even when emotion wasn't present. Then, the one who came before that, your first true love. Well, that's what he thought at the time. But looking closer now, he knew it had been a youthful infatuation. Dating for 8 years. He got tired of waiting. He wanted to make sure it was God's will. There is nothing worse than getting ahead of God. She was too impulsive. It's time to go to the singles meeting. It is best to pray first, asking for God's blessing, new friends, encouragement, maybe the right girl. Why did the old man's comments come back to him at that moment? At the same time I was praying? It had been more than 5 months ago. What was your name again? Mr. Stevens. A retiree. She said she wanted to meet him for breakfast. Asked so many questions. Never in a forced way, but with a somewhat intense purpose. And then that phrase. Well, more than one. How did he say that? I hope you'll forgive me if I'm being rude, but I want to tell you something. I don't think the way you approach women is very mature. I think you want to be chaste, like a high school boy waiting for a pretty girl to ask him out. And that image, him standing to the side, waiting for a girl to come after him. He couldn't get her out of his head. It hurt me when Mr. Stevens said that. Now it was there, like an old wound. Well, he would just have to wait for God to show him what to do. South Dakota. The men who ask, "What should I do?" They often ask another, much more troubling question. Do I have what it takes to do what a true man is called to do, by God? To do, This issue, of course, remains hidden. It makes us feel very uncomfortable. But it is there. We cannot hide from it completely. Man was designed to remember God and enter, with courage, into regions where no code exists. Because we were designed this way, we sense something is wrong when we avoid risks, and we know it. Every time we walk away from something we are too afraid to face, we feel like something is not right. However, we are too afraid to explore what is wrong and find ways to dampen the impression that something is wrong. We learn to live with a slightly restless conscience. However, the impulse to not take risks, when we capitulate to them, causes us problems. It weakens us in other areas. Sometimes, it releases other impulses that are too strong to resist, like a life of fantasies that just won't go away, perverted desires that we can't get rid of. Men who forget God often develop resentment toward their wives for being boring, fat, or unappreciative. Resentment can activate sexual demands or stifle feelings. Sexual interest. It can make you watch pornographic movies, the kind you watch at the end of the night in hotels, even compulsive masturbation or adultery. We like to blame sexual struggles on too strong a sexual drive or on crazy undertones that cross some sexual threads or on the ill will of the wives. Or we insist that the problem is simple disobedience to God and that the solution is more time on our knees reading the Word, combined with a stronger commitment to sexual purity. It is true that each of these elements can intervene in a man's struggle with sex. Certainly, the decision to disobey is involved in every act of sexual sin. But behind the obvious sin, perhaps, there is a hidden sin. An even more serious defect, but less obvious than watching pornography. A sin that weakens and deceives us to the point of making the choice to give in to immoral impulses seem reasonable, even necessary. Like an undiagnosed tumor that causes headaches, our deepest sin will continue to bear immoral fruit until it is recognized and treated. The basic problem, hidden behind our most visible problems, is that we do not strive for depth or quality in our relationships. We are not richly masculine as husbands, fathers, sons, brothers, or friends. We avoid areas of our relationships that leave us completely bewildered because we don't want to accept the responsibility of moving without a code. Any situation that requires us to act boldly confronts us with the terrifying question, do I have what it takes to be what God calls a true man? There can be no sexual health without relational health, and relational health requires us to travel a path that curves in ways we cannot predict. The first part of this book examined the energy behind the question, what should I do? We discussed the need for a code, the refusal to speak in the dark, the determination to live within the sphere of administration and therefore not fail, the choice to forget God, the reasonable desire to succeed in life. Without exercising the deepest a kind of bravery, the paralyzing impulse to be like Adam and remain silent when it is necessary to speak. Something serious happens to men and it is our silence. In the second part, something vital is missing. We take a closer look at fear, from the perspective of life working as it should, fear expressed in the question, do I have what it takes to do what I want? What should a true man called by God do? We will pay special attention to how we face this fear, Chapter 8. Two types of relationships typical of unmanly men, Chapter 9. Men who expect others to satisfy their needs, Chapter 10. Men who only need themselves, Chapter 11. So, first, what do men do when they feel afraid to enter a situation that they have no idea how to deal with? In this world, no one can avoid darkness. We are all trapped in situations that leave us confused. And usually, these situations involve unexpected problems in our relationships. A good friend of mine, whom I will call Chad, is a man whose masculinity I deeply respect. One Monday morning he woke up to the sound of a door slamming. He jumped out of bed and drew the curtains just in time. We see Scotty, his teenage son, hurrying away from the house, obviously distraught. Chad looked at the clock on the nightstand. It was 6 in the morning and the sun had barely appeared. Immediately, my friend panicked. It was obvious that something was wrong. I didn't know what it was. Should he get dressed and run after Scotty? Should you kneel in prayer? The wife, who was sleeping soundly, had not heard the noise. I was still sleeping. Should he wake her up, Chad supposed? In the few seconds it takes for someone to feel completely confused, he found his anger rising. This was not how I had planned to start the new week. The anger, he noted, was directed at his son. Scotty had been acting strange for over a month and didn't want to talk about it. Looking back, ever since he was little, Scotty had been a source of frustration. Always out of step with the family. Then, unexpectedly, the hostility changed direction. Chad was now angry with himself. Hadn't he spent enough time with his oldest son? Work demands had multiplied in recent years. Domestic services and even family outings had become less frequent. Even his wife had mentioned how involved he was in his work, but he never complained. Maybe she feared him too much, to be honest. Were things much worse than Chad thought? Was your marriage in trouble? Was Scotty involved in drugs? The boy seemed more irritable lately. His grades worsened. I was spending more time in the room. That is, in the short time I was home. What did that article Chad read in the newspaper last week say about teen suicides? What was happening to his son, to his family, to himself? Now his mind was racing. It had only been 5 minutes since the door closed and he was having a nervous breakdown. He wanted to wake up his wife and yell at her. About something, anything. I wanted to run after Scotty and get rid of him. Talk some sense into that dumb boy. No. That would only make things worse. Maybe he could take Scotty to breakfast together and have a real father-son conversation, get to work later. Spend time with your child. It seemed like a good idea. Chad told himself to calm down and stay calm. After all, everyone in his family was Christian, including grandparents, on both sides. God would make everything work out. I needed more faith. God was trustworthy. But what about the assistant pastor's daughter, pregnant at 16? Was this working? What about that missionary couple you prayed for a year before, whose only son took his own life? Had they not trusted in God? Could that be why the tragedy occurred? Bad things happened in Christian homes, better homes than yours. That was obvious. And Sid, his racquetball partner, with his 20-something son away for 2 years. Would he be dead? Involved with drugs? Too full of hate to call your parents? Sid didn't know. God, what did you promise? What can I depend on? What is predictable? What do I have to do? This is the first question men ask. Suppose that, in response to this question, Chad hears a firm voice saying, "Be a man. Decide what best reflects God's character and act accordingly. Be brave. Be wise. Be imaginative. You love God. You love your son. Do something." Most men have heard this voice. Sometimes, through an older and wiser man. I already heard it. But what should I do? We asked again. There has to be a code. There must be an expert who knows what the person knows. Do in any situation. It's okay to be confused, but don't. Completely. Twilight is a thing. Midnight darkness is another. God knows what we should do. Surely He will tell us. And then we realized, the voice was His. It's telling us what to do, but it's not code. He tells us to be men, love Him and then do what we see fit. Adam invented names for all the animals without any suggestion from God. God did not hint, see if you think ostrich is a good fit for that long-necked bird over there. Nor correct, no. Hippopotamus doesn't seem very appropriate for that animal. Rabbit makes it safer. When we finally wake up to the fact that God is waiting for us to move and speak in the darkness, that His instruction is to choose a direction consistent with what we know about Him, then we must stop asking the first question. Need. It just won't specify what we should do. We begin to face the loneliness of choosing, the terror of trusting. It is then that the second question arises from the depths of our being, accompanied by a level of fear that makes us feel more alone than ever. Do I have what it takes to do what God tells me to be a man? A manly man, right? If I act, will it be wisely? Do I have the courage to do something without any guarantee that God's supreme purposes will be fulfilled? Am I willing to enter into the mystery of a relationship with another human being, renouncing all efforts to control the outcome? There are few men who, throughout their lives, touch another human being with a liberating word that brings life. We are simply too scared to face what might happen if our wife, child, or friend escapes our control and goes on in their unpredictable individuality. If we truly choose to enter into the unpredictability of relationships, we are by no means sure that we will be able to speak a word of life. And besides, we are not sure we want people to make their own decisions when it comes to us. Could we face what would happen if the people close to us were truly emancipated? Better to keep women in their places and children quietly obedient, more seen than heard. And the men too. Friendships will continue without problems if certain topics are avoided. Deep relationships demand a lot from us. It's easier to deal with simple acquaintances. When God confronts you with a relationship situation so confusing and important that you scream, God, I want to be a man. But do I have what it takes? Well, rejoice. You are before a portal that opens onto the narrow path of true masculine goodness. It is a portal that few men have ever opened. And for good reason. No force can open it. The portal never opens for the man who approaches it with the confidence of one who is accustomed to making things happen. Only the man who has abandoned the sphere of administration, the man who has already fallen prostrate before the mystery, but who desperately longs to enter it, will, in his weakness, be strong enough to open it. No man who brings his own light into the darkness will set foot on the path that leads to manhood. Listen to the words of Isaiah. Which of you fears the Lord and obeys the word of his servant? He who walks in darkness, he who has no light, trust in the name of the Lord and lean on his God. But now all you who light fires, go and prepare. Burning torches, go, walk in the light of your fires and the torches that you enlightened yourself, see what you will receive at my hand. You will lie in torment. Isaiah 50 verses 10 and 11. Lighting our own fire is another way to describe what men do when they find themselves in a dark place. Bewildered, they turn to something they can manage, perhaps redefining the confusion into a more understandable and therefore more controllable pact. They rely on recipe theology and look to an expert to provide them with a code that tells them what to do to ensure the desired outcome. They refuse to enter the darkness armed only with the confidence that God is with them. Suppose my friend, who was awakened by the sound of a door slamming, had responded to the frantic worries he felt without humiliating himself. Suppose he had never admitted what was going on inside him, the anger, the self-accusation, the terror that filled his heart. Suppose you had stayed away from everything you felt and instead resolved to find out what needed to be done, and then do it. He would never have broken her pride, would never have been lost by her insistence on always needing to know what to do, would never have regretted her selfish demand that the important things in life work according to a plan under her control. Yes, Chad. If he had never dug deep enough into his heart to feel broken by his arrogance and humiliated by his helplessness, any choice he made that Monday morning would have been like lighting his own fire. Let me make this very clear: as long as our highest goal is to make our lives work, no matter what we do, we are lighters. But when our highest goal is to love Christ, please Him, and represent Him well to others, then any action we take will involve dependence and trust in the name of the Lord. If we truly love Christ, the direction of our choices will be chosen within the limits clearly established in the Scriptures. Maybe we'll wake up to our handcuffs, but we won't yell at them. We may not wake our wives, but we won't belittle them later for sleeping through a family crisis. Whether or not to wake up our wives is a choice we are free to make. Taking out our frustrations on them is clearly prohibited. And when the pious man does wrong, when he walks outside the light that God has given him, he ends up recognizing his mistake, fully accepting the guilt and asking for forgiveness. Chad is a godly man. Hear what it meant to him to step into the darkness without lighting his own fire. He admitted to himself how impatient, accusatory, and irritated he felt. He consciously gave himself to God like a weak man who did not know what to do, reminding himself that the purpose chosen for his entire life, including that moment on Monday morning, was to love Christ and honor Him in everything you did. He still felt angry and scared. But his heart and his will were as firmly established as his maturity level allowed. His faith seemed weak, but perhaps, he thought, it was about the size of a mustard seed. He thought for a moment and decided not to wake his wife, but to dress quickly, go downstairs, sit on the front step and wait for his son to return. The image that guided him was that of the father of the prodigal son, not searching for his son in a strange land, but anxiously awaiting his return. Perhaps the passage was not applicable. Perhaps the parable of the Lord going after the lost sheep should guide him to look for his son. I couldn't be sure. There was no light, only darkness. But I was trusting God the best way I knew how. He made a decision, even when he wasn't sure what to do. He moved, he entered into the mystery. What matters in the story is not what happened next. Of course, whether you later received the news that your son had committed suicide or welcomed him home minutes later is a vitally important question. However, the outcome of the story does not determine whether my friend acted like a man. What happened next, that Monday morning, would have required more decisions to trust, more speaking into the darkness, more movement without code. If Scotty had taken his own life, decisions would have to be made involving Chad's indescribable pain, beginning, perhaps, with the decision to let others minister to him for an extended period of time. But if the son had returned home, stormed past his father, and gone inside, a different set of decisions would have been necessary. If Scotty had come back crying, eager to open his heart, my friend would still have had decisions to make. What questions, if any, should I ask? Should I just listen? Offer advice? Pray? When we become Christians, our most important decisions are often made in the dark and under only the light of God. We need to trust a God who usually doesn't tell us exactly what to do. The Spirit whispers encouragement more often: "You can do this. I'm with you." What instructions? Now tell him the following. We need to develop a relationship with Christ in which we come to know Him well enough to behave as He would behave, understand what He would understand, and say what He would say. We need to honor our calling to reflect His habit of moving forward in darkness. Give way to beauty. God calls men to speak in the darkness that, even so, sometimes remains dark. We don't need to look for a flashlight to light the way. When we insist on knowing what to do to try to achieve our goals, we start the fire. Lighting our own fire is a natural tendency of every fallen man. And this tendency is clearly visible, not only in the relational crises of life, but also in our daily relationship style. Men who habitually light a fire, instead of trusting in God, reveal their lack of masculinity, most significantly in the way they relate to other people, particularly women. It is these unmasculine relationship patterns that we will address in the next 3 chapters. Chapter 9. The way in which unmanly men relate. It's funny how involuntary self-knowledge can seem. He had faced difficult situations on himself before. At the age of 8, the idea that he was a sinner became clear. But he wasn't the one who pursued that perception. It just happened. The opportunity was somehow dragged into some corner of his life, but it seemed more prepared by him than by him. Maybe I'm always too attentive. Some considered him introspective, sometimes morbid, too concerned with his motives and feelings. But others praised him for it. They talked about her openness and vulnerability. The admiration he received eroded. If one more person, surprised, told you how true it is, you know you would feel nauseous. Being real or true did not seem to him to be a great virtue, but rather a small part of his vocation, as inevitable and, perhaps, as necessary as breathing. This latest bout of self-discovery had come by stealth. It never culminates in a great explosion of light or an agonizing descent into brokenness. It came little by little, like a trickle of water from years past, which had now become a raging river, slowly penetrating his mind. Was he really so petty, so selfishly immature? Was he really trying to gain approval like a baby groping for milk? The evidence was in the little things, sometimes in people's honest comments about the effect it had on them. Sometimes, like now, the evidence arose from routine events that unexpectedly came into sharp focus on the way they acted. It had only been the week before. He had gone to bed early, exhausted, perhaps, by the onset of the flu. He read for a few minutes and then turned off the light. About an hour had passed. He had just fallen asleep. The wife, who was doing chores in another part of the house, heard a noise and got scared. Out of pure reflex, she called him once. And then again, this time outside the bedroom door, speaking loud enough to wake him up. Before he could respond, his wife identified the source of the noise. It was the wind coming through an open window. There was no cause for alarm. She said, "Okay." Then he apologized. "I'm sorry I woke you up." Some men would have growled, "Can't I get some sleep in my own house?" Some would have complained, simply wanting to go back to sleep. Good husbands would have cared for their wives, without grunting or complaining. Their wives would have felt that they liked them instead of bothering them. As he laid his head on the pillow, he felt 2 things. First, encouragement. He had felt tenderness toward his wife. He had not fought with her or complained. I knew he was telling the truth when he responded to her apology by saying, "It's okay. You were scared." He didn't feel proud, just encouraged. Secondly, it felt realistic. He realized that the known demons had not been cast out, and although they might have been bound, they were not gagged. He had heard them laugh at his seductive message, "Things never turn out well for you. The first night in months you went to bed early. I would have thought that someone would notice how tired you are and be worried." It's not too much to ask. It's simply asking for what you want but never get, someone who will put you first. You have already lived up to what many people expected. Is it so wrong to ask someone to be there for you? He stood there, wanting to stuff dirty rags into each demon's mouth. But he felt good about hearing a better voice, and he became more aware than ever that the real battle he needed to fight was within himself, against an enemy who posed as a friend. Charlie's job was not going well. The new COO, a super arrogant guy who thought he was cool, was making his professional life a living hell. Charlie was discouraged and quite depressed. His wife was very supportive and he appreciated it. but sometimes he felt like a huge burden. What did she really think of him? How would you react when you came home feeling down there? Maybe he talked too much about his problems. But he couldn't pretend he was okay either. He just couldn't be cheerful when he felt so depressed. On the way back home, he reflected on the best way to deal with his wife. Marcos was different. His job was as big a mess as Charlie's. But I would find a way. Mark's wife knew when things weren't going so well for him. He became more self-assured, even less reflective. She asked him how he felt. "No problem," was Mark's favorite response. And then came a torrent of criticism. The new management has no idea what would really get our company off the ground. Jenkins, that new kid, is a real peacock. He doesn't like me and he doesn't like me. But everything will work out, one way or another. And that was it. Case closed. Closed door. Dinner conversation would be pleasant, except for a few sharp jabs at the children and one or two directed at her. Then television for 3 hours. Get 100 men. Observe them closely for a week. With a minimum of discernment, you will identify these two patterns in your relationships with people. 70 or 80 will be governed by a passion called lack. Something inside them requires attention. The select few on whom they depend deeply need to be thought of and treated with specific care. They are more than willing to do their part, to do the right thing, but their goal is always the same: to get something from someone else. Charlie fits into this group, which I will call Pattern 1. The other 20 or 30 will be governed by a very different passion. The passion that controls your behavior, especially in personal relationships, is not neediness, but aggressiveness. A kind of proud attitude, like, "I don't need you or anyone else." Mark belongs to this second group, which I will call Pattern 2. In their relational styles, men are generally governed by one of these two passions. They are controlled by the passion of lack, which says, "Be there for me, dot. Fill me, I am empty, dot." Or they operate according to the passion of aggression, where the message is, "I can take care of everything without you. Believe me, keep your distance and don't give me any trouble." First, let me suggest why these two standards are basic and why most men fall into one of them. Then, in Chapter 10, we will discuss the first pattern, and in Chapter 11, we will look at the second. Because men, in one way or another, move. God wants everyone to be happy, not on our terms, which never really bring happiness, but on His. Like the owner's manual for a new car, its terms require us to use plans designed specifically for us. No man can be happy if he is not fulfilling his vocation of being a man. Exciting but superficial pleasures, the kind that do not require that we care about some deep calling to masculinity, they can seem like real happiness. Power, influence, money, position, connections, achievements, success, material possessions, money, sex, recreation, many things, each good in its place, are defined as the source of our happiness. And the most difficult thing is for them to actually deliver what they promise, or at least appear to deliver over varying periods of time, sometimes for years. They make us feel good, do something for us. But they really can't stand it. They do not produce a satisfaction that survives loss, a joy that deepens through suffering, a humble confidence that persists through failure and setback. When we pursue these sources of pleasure, we are reduced to the position of puppets, held by strings that, if cut, leave us stranded on the ground. No man can be happy without fulfilling his calling to make visible what is difficult to see about God. Happiness comes to man when he demonstrates, with his life, that God is always in motion, that darkness never stops him, and that he is continually doing something good, no matter how many bad things appear. Men are called to rise above the darkness, to enter into the mystery of relationships, until they are humble enough to trust God and then act to further God's purposes. This action, by the way, will fall to the ground with a thud if God is not in it. Most men don't even think that way. They don't even think for a second about God's call. And not even the best men fully live their masculinity. If it is true that no man can be completely happy if he does not perfectly honor God's call to be a man, then it follows that no man on earth is completely happy. Each of us struggles with some amount of unhappiness, some experience of inner emptiness and disturbing dissatisfaction that our Creator never intended us to endure. From the depths of our hearts, from those places of our being that we do not understand, a desire arises. It is a desperate longing for an answer, a void that needs to be filled. It is also a furious turbulence that does not allow us to remain still. At least to some extent, every man knows that he is not perfectly happy. And when his unfulfilled desires come to light of day, he is faced with the essential choice of human existence: trust in God or not to trust Him, light your own fire or depend on the name of the Lord. If you trust in God, unhappiness, which must continue until death. It is surrounded by hope, acceptance, meaning, despite imperfection. Receive power to move well. This brings joy. If you refuse to trust, inner unhappiness becomes your most pressing problem. He needs to find some way to deal with her. We need to understand a simple principle: every man is moving. Movement defines the existence of man. But not all movement is good. Therefore, when man does not move as he should, he will move inappropriately. When good movement stops, bad movement begins. The good movement is the one that goes through personal unhappiness to reach God. The bad move is one whose goal is never above the alleviation of personal unhappiness. Since men, like women, are fundamentally relational beings, any movement will be seen most clearly in the way the man relates. Man will awaken life and beauty in the people he meets or destroy that same life and beauty. Man's effect on others may be imperceptible or dramatic, but it is there. No interaction that lasts a few seconds, no conversation, no matter how casual, fails to change the other person. Manly men free others from their control and encourage them with their influence. They touch their wives, children, and friends in sensitive ways that free them to struggle with their loneliness, selfishness, and pain. Manly men gently lead their family and friends to the same crossroads where they, as men, have found that trust or disbelief that needs to be chosen. Unmanly men demand that their friends and family meet their demands. Men who move with control, anger, and terror lull others into a state of conformity or incite them into self-preserving rebellion. Because, Standard 1. Unmanly men, who practice the first wrong move pattern in relationships, who insist that others be there for them, understand that happiness can never be found in isolation, only in community. Their environment usually includes someone who gave them intense pleasure, perhaps an indulgent mother, an overly generous father, an overly helpful, perhaps inappropriately involved, youth pastor, or a famous athlete who gave him an autograph. As children, these men learned a simple lesson: inner pain is more likely to be relieved when someone does something for them. A strategy forms in the mind of the pattern 1 thinker, a strategy that adapts to his inclination not to move in a way that might reveal his insufficiency, to make others respond to my needs without requiring any movement on my part. Now he doesn't have to face his own terror of the darkness and his true need for God, and he has hope. The passion of lack governs all the decisions of the man who follows pattern 1, to marry or not to marry, this woman or that one, make decisions that affect his career, choose activities with friends, decide whether or not to hit your children. This same passion governs even the smallest decisions. Should I tell my wife what I feel? Will I go to that party? Should I complain about that waiter's service? Like the rich man's son, who depends on the monthly checks he receives from the inheritance his father left him, the man ruled by his own lack thinks he has the right to never have to move alone. He is willing to be responsible, to a certain extent, and is almost always willing to be kind and considerate, sometimes even sacrificially helpful, but always with the requirement that someone notice him and that someone give him what he wants and give him what he wants. Make you feel good. This is the man from pattern 1. Standard 2. Unmanly men turn on others with a well-managed display of neediness, or push people away from them enough to avoid any meaningful sense of connection. Men ruled by the passion of aggression usually have a history more characterized by abandonment or anger than by pleasurable involvement. Rigid discipline, busy fathers, distant mothers, unimpressive churches, legalistic theology, relational connection never existed in these men's experience. Men who now operate under pattern 2 were hungry for relationships, but lost hope. It was easier to kill her desires for intimacy and move on with her life than to accept her desires and pain. Admitting how much they wanted a connection became, for them, a greater terror than the prospect of searching for a relationship and never finding one. Skills often emerged that allowed them to find the pleasures of a long-distance relationship. Athletic talent, academic ability, social grace, or manual skill gave them the opportunity to feel powerful and achieve goals worthy of recognition. Over time, the pattern 2 man becomes so dependent on his abilities that his human desire for connection becomes stifled. And that's how he wants it to be. Distance maintains safety. There is no need to feel that soul-crushing terror, to need what perhaps does not belong to you. In a sense, this man is as needy as the one who lives by standard 1. Men with any of these relationship styles demand that others give them what they expect. But men who are in touch with their needs need affirmation and close support from those close to them. And aggressive men want the respect of a broader audience that stays at a distance. The styles may be different, but both are selfish and cause great damage. One of the great tragedies of life is that no man fully sees the damage his unmanly style of relationships inflicts on others. Those who glimpse descend into the depths of brokenness and contrition. And it is from these depths that genuine repentance springs. When a broken man repents, the Spirit gives him new vision. A cool stream makes its way through the burning desert of its brokenness. The hope of truly blessing others, raising your wife, positively influencing your children, encouraging your friends. It becomes stronger than the terror of entering the darkness. And the good movement begins. Good movement never happens by chance. Nor does it develop naturally. There is always a struggle against powerful impulses in the other direction. Good movement always arises from regret for bad movement. And repentance comes after a recognition of error, which leads to brokenness, and a deep confession that only humility can create. In the next 2 chapters, I discuss these 2 patterns in more detail. See if you can fit it in somewhere, if it's not clearly in a story or description, maybe between the lines. We are all there. Chapter 10. Men who demand others to live up to their expectations. The courtship had been stormy. Perhaps this was what was expected at her age. She, in her early 30s, he, almost 40. After so many years of celibacy, they were already firm in their habits. They had overcome the innocence of dreamy idealism. They were no longer desperate to get married and were now determined not to make any mistakes. It had been difficult. And it was still difficult, just 3 weeks before the big day. But something kept them together. He thought it was love. I wanted to believe it, but I wasn't sure. Her doubts surfaced more strongly when she felt that something was imposing itself on her. Sometimes I feel like your mother, like you want me to be ready with milk and cookies when you get home from school. And I hate that. I hate feeling like this. The image of her as his mother came to mind most clearly when he expressed his pain over something she had done or failed to do. He looked so pathetic, like a lost child. That same image was also evoked, although less strongly, when he complained of fatigue, tension at work or concerns about his health. He called it sharing or being vulnerable about your struggles. She felt obligated to be there for him. In a remarkably rare and honest moment, after another long discussion about his feelings on the issue, he admitted, "I can never go through fights without feeling like a child. Every time I tell him I'm suffering, I feel like a little child. Maybe I really want you to be my mother. When I was little, The only time I remember feeling my mother's tenderness was when I was grieving. Her eyes filled with tears. There was a long pause. A memory crossed his mind. I broke my wrist when I was in 5th grade. I fell off the bike. The bone went through the skin and was exposed. The doctor had to put it back in. I was scared to death. I can see Mom standing next to my bed in the emergency room. I have never felt so protected, so cared for. I could see it in his eyes. Sob. She felt the need to touch him. But that maternal image returned and made the impulse to touch him seem impure. Seconds passed. 1 minute. He stopped crying and looked up. Did you feel like that right now? Like my mother? Do you want to take care of me? She hesitated and then spoke quietly. Yes, but I wish I hadn't felt that. His eyes dried immediately. He looked at her confused and furious. Almost screaming, he said, "Is it so wrong to want my fiancée to feel some of my pain? Does that make you my mother? Can a man never want his woman to simply be there for him?" More tears. Now they were both crying. They felt frustrated. They felt the darkness. "What are we going to do?" she asked. "I don't know," he replied. Unmanly men live to get what they think they need. Unmanly men who are carried away by the passion of need try to obtain it from others. And Mrs. Ray said, "When I hear my husband's car pull into the driveway after work, my heart sinks. I immediately start to feel even more tired than before. I am a housewife with 3 children to take care of all day and here comes the 4th. What does he do to make you feel like this?" I asked. At that moment he was sitting next to her, managing to look sullen and hurt at the same time. 1,001 things, she replied. It could be a sigh when he walks through the door or a comment about the traffic on the way home. Sometimes he tells me how tired he is. It could be anything. But it's always about him, something that's wrong, like he's expecting me to do something. Even when he asks about me, I feel compelled to ask about him. If he helps me with dinner, I get that look that tells me I should tell him how wonderful he is. And if I do something special, even a little free thing, like a warmest greeting, he goes overboard in his appreciation. It makes me feel how much he really needed it, that I'd better keep giving it to him or he'll hurt himself badly. Sometimes when he's super attentive, I think he's telling me that he'd better be available for sex, but a lot of times that's not it. I don't know how else to explain it. Everything he does to me suggests that he expects me to be there for him. Many needy men hide their need better than this lady's husband. They can be much more subtle and manly in their expression of need. And each of us follows the pattern of aggressive or needy men at various times in our lives. There is no such thing as simply being a standard 1 man or simply being a standard 2 man. But a pattern often becomes the theme of our relationship style. The man who normally follows the first pattern lives his life thinking that others should be there for him. Your sense of need is so real, so deep, and so compelling that asking for understanding or attention seems completely reasonable. Your life depends on achieving this. The pattern 1 man is defined by his need, just as some men today are defined by their homosexual inclinations. For homosexuals, not coming out and admitting their impulses seems like a betrayal of their identity, a violation of something basic in them, which belongs to their essential nature. The same goes for men whose need seems to be the center of their being. They feel more comfortable and alive when someone cares for them. More than anything, they consider themselves needy. And someone needs to do something about it. When they feel disappointed, when someone is not there to help them, men who define themselves by their needs feel that others have failed them miserably. Justice was not served. Rights were denied. The human community was inhumane to them. The result of this, naturally, is anger. Resentment simmers and seems justified. And with righteous resentment comes righteous revenge. Think how easily our lips spill sarcastic comments and lash out at people. With cutting comments, Perhaps we only inflict minor injuries, such as cuts with paper, but they hurt. That, of course, is the intention. Hurting someone who did not live up to what was expected of them. Men governed by the passion of necessity return money, if not with sarcasm and politeness, at least with irritability, bad temper or indifference. Wives who fail men out of necessity must pay. The same goes for the friends of these men. But men in need don't see the harm they cause to those around them. From his perspective, it was others who failed him, and not him, his wife, children and friends. The needy man, confronted with his cruelty, often reacts like a hungry beggar caught stealing a loaf of bread. Look, maybe what I did was wrong. I'm sure he was. But you have to understand what I've been through. And because of the hunger I feel, I don't ask for too much. A certain man acquired the habit of walking through a neighborhood of prostitutes, occasionally looking for one of them or going to see a nude show, while he persuaded himself that his sin was not as perverse as the one his family had committed. Him when he was little and the way his wife failed him now. 25 years of counseling experience leads me to believe that 9 out of 10 men are more concerned about how others let them down than how they hurt them. And married men especially worry about the ways their wives fail them. Men ruled by need benefit from the fact that our culture is committed to not blaming the victim. For example, when a father neglects a male baby, we do not hold the baby responsible for that father's or mother's failure, nor for the harm that failure caused. We support the child in their grief and do everything we can to protect them from further harm. But we have taken this protection of the victim too far. We have denied the responsibility of adult victims to suffer gracefully or to continue doing good. We have allowed the severity of the wrongs others have committed against us to blind us to God's immutable call to be holy. As a young boy victim of parental neglect matures, we must be careful to encourage him to develop an identity built around the opportunities of masculinity, not around its pain and need. But developing this type of identity requires the work of the Holy Spirit. No one spontaneously considers himself an image bearer whose highest calling is to reflect the character of an invisible God. There are more pressing issues that demand our attention, such as getting what we need to survive. And what we need to survive more comfortably. Men facing bankruptcy often invest more effort in figuring out how to pay their bills than in learning to know God. No harm from others or any circumstance in life can destroy the image of God within us, or nullify the call to reflect that image well. However, we tend to think otherwise. Pain speaks so loudly that it is difficult for us to hear God's call to live as men. Violating the image of God, using unethical business practices, or seducing another man's wife may seem like a no-brainer. We all struggle with things that don't seem so bad, especially when we feel particularly disappointed. Only when the Spirit of God, through His Word, exposes the thoughts and attitudes of the heart, will we be able to see clearly. Only thereafter will the dominant passion of lack be recognized as such, a sinful basis for relating to others that is not worthy of men. The example of Saul. King Saul is perhaps the most prominent biblical example of a man driven by misery who, as always happens when needs rule our lives, lost his dignity. One incident among many that could be chosen demonstrates this. Read 1 Samuel, verse 15, to see the entire story. I will summarize here. One day, Saul committed a particularly serious sin that led God to reject him as king. Talking to Samuel shortly after sinning, Saul denied having done anything wrong. Pay attention to the fact that at this point, when he still thought his sin had gone unnoticed, Saul claimed that he had not been disobedient. I fulfilled the Lord's instructions, he announced to Samuel. These instructions included killing every living creature that had belonged to the Amalekites, a nation whose complete destruction God had decreed. In reality, Saul had saved the Amalekite king, a man named Agag, and did not kill all the animals, deciding first to keep the best cows and sheep, to sacrifice them to the Lord, according to his later testimony. In an almost comical passage, Samuel responds to Saul's declaration of total obedience by asking, "What is this sheep's bleating in my ears?" What is that cattle mooing I hear? Saul was caught. He could no longer deny his disobedience. He hadn't destroyed everything. And so he changed his song of denial to what, at first glance, seems like a confession: I have sinned. I violated the Lord's order. But the rest of the story makes clear that Saul's recognition of sin did not arise from brokenness. Saul was struggling, looking for a way to avoid God's judgment and preserve the advantages of his role as king. It clearly illustrates the truth that without brokenness over sin there can be no genuine confession or sincere repentance. Saul does not demonstrate a broken and contrite spirit. Nothing of the sort. Beforehand, he asks Samuel to return to the capital and stay at his side, in public worship, hoping that Samuel's presence will bring him some continuity of the respect he received as king. But Samuel remained inexorable: I will not return to you. The Lord has rejected him as king over Israel. Now watch closely what Saul does next, driven entirely by his sense of desperate need. I have sinned, said Saul. I have violated the command of the Lord and the instructions you gave me. I was afraid of the soldiers and I attended to them. Now I beg you, forgive my sin and return to me, so that I may worship the Lord. 1 Samuel 15 verses 24 and 25. But Samuel said to him, I will not return to you. You have rejected the word of the Lord, and the Lord rejected him from the king of Israel. When Samuel turned to leave, Saul grabbed the edge of his cloak, and the cloak torn. And Samuel said to him, Today the Lord took the kingdom of Israel from you and gave it to one who is better than you. Isaiah 15, 26, 28. The passion of lack becomes a dominant passion when it is considered stronger and more urgent than a desire. Tie-in for holiness. If only I could have. It becomes the ambition that drives everything the needy man does. It is important to recognize the principle highlighted by Saul's life: a heightened sense of need, if not accompanied by an even greater sense of sin, justifies and strengthens selfishness. The people most aware of their lack of that of their sinfulness are people who manipulate and demand. People more aware of their sinfulness. They repent and develop a dominating passion for holiness. Only such people learn to trust in God's love and enjoy His favor. Almost 30 years of marriage have made it clear to me that I lean more towards this style of relationship than the one I will analyze in the next chapter. In general, I feel more needy than aggressive. When I am suffering, I am inclined to see my need for comfort as an opportunity for someone else to do good. The call to rise above my need, trust completely in God, and do good to others is sometimes hard to hear. The deeper the pain, the less inclined I am to listen to it. When the passion of lack dominates, no consolation can fully satisfy. Some needy men may even thank their wives for their efforts. This, however, will generally be with the same enthusiasm as a man who needs $100 and thanks his friend who gives him 25 cents. Any disposition toward gratitude soon gives way to demanding criticism. I don't know why you had to keep making dinner while I was talking about our financial problems. Is it too much to ask for a minute of your attention? The person who undertakes the task of meeting the needs of a needy person has no hope of success. No effort is enough, no kindness is enough. People who identify with the pattern one man often feel pressured to be there for him. Bad, because they never correspond properly. Over time, the pressure and feelings of guilt can become overwhelming. This process can take 20 or 30 years and one day they stop trying. Why should I bother? Nothing I do ever satisfies him. The frustration of relating to a pattern one man is often the reason for the end of a long-standing friendship or marriage. Those who continue trying to meet the needs of the needy feel increasingly exhausted, until depression sets in. The wife of the needy man finds herself dreaming of a better relationship, in which she will be noticed and appreciated. And she begins to notice other men, how they treat their wives, how they treat her, and little by little, she becomes vulnerable to the slightest hint of affection. He seems to like me. Sometimes novels or soap operas offer relief. Sometimes it's staying busy, more church work, more work hours, more social clubs, more housework, more education. Women married to needy men feel alone and scared. They are often not happy with themselves. Many hide their pain under the guise of competence. They become aggressive and harsh, unable to worship, relax or laugh. Hear the cry of the needy, be there for me. Don't you know how empty I am, how desperate I feel, how painful my life is? Why you can't be more considerate? Support me more? Speak more kindly? To lose weight? Read more books? Take the initiative in bed? Ask me more questions? Spend less? Dress more attractively? Criticize me less? Talk less at parties? Cook more creatively? A gentleman sent me a letter, in response to a book I wrote. You didn't answer the one question I needed you to answer, the one I assumed you would address in your book. I want to know why some women just don't take care of themselves. I am many times a millionaire. I am an elder in our church. I let him buy whatever he wants. I am not a workaholic and I have never been unfaithful to my wife. What I want to know is, why doesn't my wife lose weight? I stay in good shape, but she doesn't mind exercise. He has gained 20 kilos in the last 2 years. I find her as attractive as a bowl of jello. I even told her I would go to therapy with her to see what I might be missing. I just don't understand it. What happens to women like my wife? Like most men dominated by the passion of reference, this man. You don't find anything wrong with yourself. You only see what the other person could do differently. Feel justified in your anger. You can't see their needs beyond your own. Because he is blinded by his need, the quality of the relationship he offers his wife is inferior. But he doesn't see that. Any struggle you may have with sexual temptation is considered a result of the way you have been treated. In his opinion, his efforts to remain sexually pure and noble and require nothing from him other than more time in the Word and on your knees. It never occurs to him that he doesn't love his wife as he should, that he's not really a great man, that he never learned to speak lovingly in the confusion and pain of the relationship. When we are governed by the passion of lack and believe that our deepest enjoyment depends on others meeting our expectations, we destroy life and tarnish beauty. At this point, we are not manly men. Chapter 11. Men who only need themselves. The passion for aggressiveness. It always seemed to fit. Whatever the meeting was, boardroom, dinner, or church social, he felt comfortable. He knew the right people, he always dressed accordingly and with charm and friendliness, he got along well with any group of people. He could be quite dogmatic at times. And his best friends, the ones who were with him most often, had seen his self-confidence overflow and he became aggressive. Although his acquaintances might not have realized it, he was an intensely private man. He rarely talked about personal struggles and was inclined to quickly resolve any relational tension that he could not avoid or dismiss. He never analyzed himself or anyone else. His family felt the impact of his superficial involvement. Self-awareness, of course, was not among his virtues. If asked for a self-description, you might use words like sociable, cultured, successful, good family man, dedicated Christian. I could even say manly. He would never guess why someone would ask him to describe himself, nor would he invite the questioner to talk about what he was thinking. From time to time, in fact, he gave way to emotions, when he went to his wife's room after the mastectomy they had performed on her. His father's funeral, when he proposed a toast to his daughter and her fiancé at the wedding reception. But he never cried. No one had ever seen him fall apart. Once, the eldest son asked when was the last time he cried openly. When I was a kid, he replied disinterestedly, as if the question had been, when was the last time you used acne medication? He was a good person to have as a golf partner or as a business partner. And, without a doubt, he was the right man to have on your side in a debate. But he wasn't someone you'd feel inclined to share what was on your heart. His wife was terribly lonely. But he would never have guessed it. He buried his pain deeply, under the symbols of moderate wealth and under the circle of important activities that the social class demanded. She took care of garden clubs, political meetings, the church's women's ministries board and decorating the house. Her 3 attractive children were the big red bow that beautifully finished off the well-decorated package of her life. As with most perfect lives, there was a dark spot, an ugly wrinkle on the woman's surgically smoothed face. Panic attacks. It's not serious, but it is worrying. They tended to arise when I felt like I had lost control of things. The first was caused because her daughter went to college and began a relationship with someone her husband considered lower class. She calmly spoke to her daughter about her concerns, convinced that the girl would see reason. And she did it. She ended up marrying a doctor. The husband treated the dating crisis with sarcasm. That's when he used the term lower class. The attacks had been regular but inconsistent, some worse than others. The medications helped. She could take medication with a specialist, her husband's golf partner. Her husband made an appointment for her. He even managed to obtain the first formula himself. In his opinion, that solved everything. Toothache? See a dentist. Panic attacks? Take a pill. He never talked to her about the attacks, never analyzed her fears. 3 times she opened up and admitted how distant she felt from her husband, how unnecessary she felt except as his social and sexual partner. The first time, to a close friend, who changed the subject. The second, to a cousin who was visiting them, a man he barely knew. He was a little older and seemed very friendly. One night they stayed up talking late into the night. Years of repressed feelings were released. He heard her. It had felt so good. But he never mentioned it again, not a word the next morning, not a single follow-up phone call, not a letter. He wished he had never said anything. The third time was 2 years later, with a therapist he met and spoke to at a party. In reality, he had said very little. But the therapist seemed to understand more than what was being said. And she seemed worried. Once again it was a good feeling. She thought about going to a professional consultation, but decided to give up after mentioning the idea to her husband. "Why do you need a crazy doctor?" Was all he said. There was another moment. It was the last night of a week-long Bible conference. The message was about God's love for lost sheep, those who felt abandoned, without hope of being found. He hit her. She quickly disappeared during the final prayer and walked alone around the lake. It was so calm, so warm and reassuringly dark, with only the light of a crescent moon reflecting off the still water. An irresistible feeling of peace invited her to release her tears at the security it offered. He fell onto the soft grass, buried his head in his hands, and sobbed uncontrollably. The words flowed without restriction from his heart, expressing what had been denied to him for so long. "I can't take it anymore. It hurts a lot. Nobody loves me. My marriage is empty. I'm more alone than I can bear." He returned to his room after midnight, his eyes swollen. He was sitting on the bed, reading. "Where have you been?" She asked. "I was worried about you. I've been out there, walking, thinking. Praying. I even cried a little." "You didn't forget to take your medicine, did you?" "No," she answered, without feeling anything. So he got ready to go to bed. Nothing more was said. He leaned down to kiss her forehead, smiled reassuringly, then rolled over and fell asleep. She was fine the next morning. In these chapters one talk about 2 types of men, those dominated by necessity and those dominated by the determination to be aggressive. These 2 relationship styles are actually extreme positions, at the extremes of a long spectrum. In this chapter, we will talk about aggressive men. However, it might be good to preface this discussion by talking a little about the spectrum. I'm not trying to suggest another type theory for categorizing men. I don't want men to read this book and say, "Yeah, that's me. I guess that's just how I am." I hope that many men recognize their relationship patterns and respond, "This is how I treat my wife, or my friends. How horrible. I'm more of a man than that." I want us to grow in humanity by understanding not only God's design for men, but also our ways of corrupting that plan. Needy men are corrupt men. They are more likely to be aware of their thirst for affirmation when interacting with others and more predisposed to enter into conflict. Relationships, for the not-so-noble reason of basically satisfying their own needs. Aggressive men are the same, but corrupt in a different way. They deny any deep longing for relationships and pursue goals that do not require meaningful intimacy with people. These patterns represent two opposite extremes in how men relate to each other. These are the two extremes of a long spectrum that can be represented as follows. Relationship style. Patterns. Dominated due to lack. More sensitive than strong. Perfectly balanced, sensitive and strong. Stronger than sensitive. Dominated by aggressiveness. Only one man in history has managed to do it well. He was deeply aware of everything he proposed. And this awareness brought with it pain and hope, both sadness for what was, and joy for what he knew would one day happen. He felt her disappointment, but no more acutely than he felt her anticipation. He cried profusely and unashamedly about lost relationships and the cost of regaining them. He was deeply aware of everything that was happening around him and within him. But his sensitivity never led him to worry about himself or complain. Instead of simply feeling hurt by broken relationships, in a deeper way than any of us could imagine, he used that pain to more clearly define and energize his calling. He delighted in sacrificing all pleasures, both the legitimate joys that he had known from all eternity and the illegitimate satisfactions that were available to him, for the singular purpose of making people see what his Father was really like. For him, nothing mattered more than revealing God as he was and is, someone who steadfastly hates sin and inexorably loves people. By defining himself in terms of his calling, rather than his desires or power, he found the courage to do whatever his calling required. He exemplified pure masculinity by entering regions he had never entered before. Compare his pre-existence with God, before Bethlehem, with the darkness of Calvary, and he stayed perfectly on course, if you never slip an inch despite of tests of incomparable gravity. He was the only man who lived his life exactly in position C, perfectly sensitive, yet invincibly strong, humbly dependent, yet resolutely determined, conscious of every detail, in every relationship, but unwaveringly focused on his priority relationship. Jesus combined in himself virtues that are infallibly competitive in us. Sensitivity and strength do not coexist easily. Men with well-developed sensitivity often struggle with feelings of inadequacy, a tendency towards self-pity and complaining, and a distressing sense of discontent. Men who are more conscious of their ability to move seem to devote more energy to tasks than to people. They become harsh, distant and emotionally dull, protected by a veneer of convincing affability. Men who relate more based on their needs, position A. They are the ones that women call weak. Men whose perception of their needs has made them sensitive to the things that happen inside people, position B. They often fit the criteria of masculinity established by many in the feminist movement. They are meek, unafraid to cry, and capable of intensely personal relationships. Discussions. Sometimes years pass before their lack of strength is evident and the damage they cause is recognized. In positions A and B, the lack compromises the relationship. Men driven by lack fail to nurture life in others and enjoy the beauty of the individuality and independence of others. Your relationships, in general, are intense but continually restless, or they are experiencing a slow, agonizing, sputtering death, like an old car that spends more time in the shop than on the road. The relationships of an aggressive man, on the other hand, are usually superficial but stable. Stability, however, is fragile. Like houses built on sand, the aggressive man's relationships depend on a conspiracy to pretend that superficiality is satisfactory and that the pleasures of comfort and excitement are acceptable substitutes for the lost joys of communion. When a spouse or friend enters the conspiracy and asks for more from the aggressive man, the relationship explodes like a long-dormant volcano. That's when good things can happen, but they rarely do. Either the exploitative partner repents and returns to the comforts of superficial stability, or the relationship ends after disintegrating into violent conflict. Men who are stronger than sensitive, position D. They constitute the majority of Christian and secular leadership. Anyone who has ever held a leadership position is familiar with the attacks that must be endured. It often seems that personal sensitivities need to be mitigated in order to survive, and that a keep doing your job attitude needs to be cultivated. Nice guys, sensitive men who care about not hurting others and not being hurt themselves, finish last. Tough men, whose tender muscles have atrophied from lack of voluntary use, reach the top and stay there. Anyone in the spotlight should expect criticism. If I spread my ideas publicly on a table with the intention of influencing others, my ideas must be studied and criticized. However, too much criticism directed at leaders reflects a spiteful spirit of arrogance. Critics who stand out for the strength of their work are, in general, more aggressive men than the leaders they criticize. They are insensitive to the impact they have on people. They walk over anyone who disagrees with them, with a confidence that attracts needy men who would like to be aggressive. They make the difficult life of the leader even more difficult. Most leaders, especially pastors and Christian ministry directors, feel undervalued and unappreciated. The fight, in general, seems petty and immature to them, but it does not stop. One pastor nearly cried when he told me about a time when his board of elders questioned whether he really needed 3 weeks of vacation. Sometimes it seems like there is no other solution than to build a wall around your heart. The effect on those who manage to build a wall is the loss of a rich passion, along with the growth of a determination to effectively manage whatever is manageable. When determination replaces sensitivity, man becomes aggressive. Sacrifice the power to delve deeper into the lives of others. Sometimes your only contact with the world of passion is sex. That's all you can do. Think. He lives on the brink of moral failure. The solution to your sexual addiction requires more than self-control. It implies a renewed willingness to open the heart to the sting of criticism, a willingness that can give the impression of giving in to the blow. If you remain hard-hearted and well-protected from pain, you will eventually be overwhelmed, more by the need to be aggressive than by your calling to reflect the character of God. And if those closest to him don't give him an honest answer about the suffering his growing distance is causing them, then there's a good chance he'll move even further from the center of the spectrum to the extreme of a powerfully dominated man. Because of his need to be aggressive, position E. And it will seem so necessary, so justified. I have seen shepherds writhe in such agony that I almost wanted them to be aggressively anesthetized in order to survive. But while this would provide short-term relief, it would be a long-term mistake. Aggressive men destroy relationships. They harm people by demanding they act without providing real food for their souls. Women who have relationships with aggressive men. If you see, you usually feel unwanted, due to an unspecified but presumed ugliness that explains why aggressive men never stop. You are afraid to love them. Desperate for someone or something to touch them deeply enough to ease the pain of loneliness. Victims of aggressive men are responsible for how they choose to act, but not for how much they suffer. These victims are prone to depression. I have nothing anyone could want. Why should I bother trying? Relate or continue. Anxiety. If I could keep control over myself, I'll be fine. Oh no. What can happen? What if I lose control? Addictions. I can't get away from anything pleasant enough to ease my loneliness, even if it soothes it just for a moment. Aggressive men rarely change without first facing the destructive impact they have on others. Therefore, it is crucial that those involved with aggressive men risk getting clear feedback on how this domination through aggression affects people. Truly strong men are as different from aggressive men, just as sensitive and mature men are different from weak men. Aggressive men have three characteristics in common that hide their aggressiveness. First, insecurity. Aggressive men are forced, by uncertainty about their masculinity, to prove their worth. They show their power to demonstrate what they are not sure they possess. Strong men, on the other hand, do not feel the slightest need to flaunt their strength. They have control over their power and release it only to further a good purpose. Secondly, superficiality. Once you get over his competence and charm, you'll realize that men who position themselves on the aggressive side of the spectrum aren't all that interesting people. They are not particularly aware of what is going on within themselves or others, and they do not feel anything more deeply than their desire for power. Strong men, however, are not afraid to face all of reality, including unpleasant things about themselves or others that could cause overwhelming despair. Strong men remember God and speak with the power of hope in the darkest night. Third, misunderstandings. Aggressive men have not grasped the essence of true masculinity. They confuse sensitivity with weakness. In their minds, power and strength are the same. Strong men know that sensitivity and perception open the door to mysterious compartments that require courage to enter. And your desire to live bravely overcomes your fear of the dark. They define strength as power under control and not as demonstrated power. Aggressive men fear compartments. They know their power is no match for the invisible power that lives in the darkness. They stay away from the darkness by never becoming sentient, and their determination to avoid mystery makes them more focused on effectively managing whatever they face. Their power degenerates into more selfish, more destructive and more malevolent forms of aggression. We all fit somewhere on the line, whether it's left or right of center. Rapists without conscience, examples of power without sensitivity, are at one end of this line. Pornography addicts, who sacrifice family and respect for one more naked spectacle, would be at the other extreme, living for immediate relief from this pain produced by sensitivity without strength. Most readers of this book find themselves somewhere between these two extremes, but none of them live exactly in the center. Because why can no man be singled out as a perfect illustration of position C except one? Why do so few men come close to this? Why is modern culture creating achievable standards of masculinity that assure us we are not doing too badly and then encourage others to join us in lowering the target? Men with well-developed sensitivity tend to ask that others be there for them, that is, at their disposal. And when no one does, at least not in the way they expect, these men become vulnerable to passive perversions, pornography, compulsive masturbation, fantasies of women who respond to their every desire, dreams of winning the lottery. Men who act bravely but without knowledge of themselves or others feel a different emptiness that drags them into aggressive perversions, seduction, sadism, abuse, wealth and position. We really are a disaster. Nobody can do it well. But why? The answer, of course, takes us back to Genesis 3, when Adam refused to speak. Since then, every naturally conceived man has been transmitted a congenital corruption in the design of man. But the fact that our problem is inherited should not be used to allow us to avoid responsibility. We need to face the terrible truth that we are responsible for not speaking sensitively and forcefully, and we must despair of the even more terrible truth that the impulse not to speak is too strong within us to resist alone. Facing these twin truths will lead us toward brokenness, confession, repentance, and trust. Not facing them will leave us with the illusion that things may be bad, but not bad enough that God is really necessary. Something vital is missing in men. We lack the courage and faith to speak to the darkness with vital power. This lack of courage and faith must be understood as a sin. Sin is at the center of all our problems. That is the simple and terrible truth. Nothing explains why we sin. The fact that we sin is the basis of all clear thinking about our problems. But there is a second level of understanding, a level that is based on the foundation of having us trace all the difficulties back to the fall. This second level involves man's relationships with other men. After original sin, there is no more powerful influence on the life of man than the influence of older men and their peers, older men, whose lives we have observed and who have committed themselves to us, particularly in our formative years, and peers, colleagues and friends with whom we spend time. Exchange stories and tell things that we don't tell anyone else. There is something truly powerful at our disposal. In the third part, one suggests that our relationships, as fathers and brothers, can help us recover the lost dream of masculinity. Conclusion of the second part. Not many men enjoy the richness of masculine maturity. Only 2 of the men who were delivered from Egypt crossed the Jordan River and entered Canaan. The rest wandered aimlessly through the desert until they died. The path to maturity begins with an honest examination of how we relate to one another. What effect do we have on people? If they had the courage, what would our wives, children, and friends tell us about what it's like to be in a relationship with us? Do we show that we are needy and demand that others take care of us? Do people feel pressured to treat us well? Or do others see us as aggressive, strong to the point that we don't really need people much, and distant enough to neither offer nor demand intimacy? Since we do not have the courage to enter into the mystery, we are dominated by needy or aggressive passions. Neither needy nor aggressive men are authentic men. End of this second part.